My name's Tim Carney. I'm Director of Product Management here at DevBridge. And this morning we're going to talk about story map refactoring. And what does that even mean? I imagine some of you are familiar with the concept of story mapping already. Maybe some of you are not. It's fairly embedded in product orgs at this point. It's went out. I think this book, User Story Mapping, show of hands, who has this book? Anybody? I tried to find one in the office and couldn't find the prop, but you know, that's what it looks like. I have a Kindle version, so I can't hold up my Kindle version. This guy's name is Jeff Patton, and he sort of created this method that probably most of us are using these days around how do we figure out what we're going to build, right, in a way that is all-encompassing to all the stakeholders involved. And here's sort of the quote he has in the preface of this book. Story mapping keeps us focused on users and their experience, and the result is a better conversation and ultimately a better product. I think most people agree with that because people are doing this, including us at DevBridge, right? So we make a point to take a lot of photos of this process when we do it with our clients because it's really important for how we go about ultimately winning business. It's part of how we scope a project, but it's also part of how we demonstrate expertise to clients who are interested in working with us as we try to very quickly understand what their business problem is, who their end users are, who the people in the room are, and what their intentions and potentially biases are, and work through problems together, sometimes in this office, sometimes in client offices. To ultimately end up with something that looks like this. What do we want to get out of that process? The largest obstacle to coming up with something that we want to build is getting people aligned. So especially in this consulting environment, we have potential customers come in to talk to us about problems and frequently have stakeholders in the room that are not normally even in the room together. In a large organization, they know they have problems to fix, and they pull SMEs from different parts of the organization and throw them in a room and say, figure out how we're going to fix our problems. And everyone shows up in the room with their own idea of what they think the solution looks like. So they have a vision in their heads, and they have no idea, kind of going into the process, how aligned they are or not. So this process forces those stakeholders to put their ideas up on the board, and then we can see them. And they can see each other's thoughts and understand where they agree and where they disagree. And through dialogue and asking the right questions, the point is to get everyone kind of thinking the same sort of thing so that they walk out of the room, and when we ultimately propose work, whether it's new work or the next phase of work, we all have a shared sense of what we're going to be working on together. We start with something like this, right? We call this our box of fun. Everything you need to run a story mapping workshop. And what does it actually look like for those who haven't gone through this? We ask stakeholders to write down the tasks that they think their end users ultimately have to do to capture the full set of requirements. And they can be kind of different levels of granularity. So there's 3 examples of probably what we all did this morning, I assume, certainly myself. At a high level, I could say, oh, I got cleaned up. Maybe a level below that, I definitely took a shower, and as part of taking a shower, you know, there's specific acts within there. In working with people who maybe aren't even used to this process, you're going to end up with a wall of ideas that are going to be all over the place in terms of something very granular, something very big, and you need to make sense of it. A more sort of technical example might be something like this. We use search engines in every product pretty much these days. You know, managed search results is something that we want users to be able to do, but that's very high level. Okay, we want them to filter search results. Okay, no, we want them to filter search results by category. Again, as we scope work for a project, we might get all different levels of granularity or fidelity on this stuff. But we get it all on the board, and we try to make some sense of it. So we organize the stories into groups, affinity mapping, and get a sense of these kinds of things in these piles are kind of the same, and then these piles are all kind of the same to ultimately drive towards something that looks like this. This is what a story map looks like, with high-level sort of themes of work on top, epics and stories below it. Again, coming out of a workshop, a lean requirements workshop that we run, these yellow sticky notes are going to be kind of all over the place in terms of how clear they are, how big they are, how small they are, and we need to work on them. But what we can do in the room is get further alignment with the stakeholders on relative priority of these things, right? So we organize them to some degree. What do we need to think about first? What do we need to think about second? What should we not even think about? What is this process good at? We just talked about alignment, right? So stakeholders come in, they're not sure if they're aligned. We try to force some alignment on them as we walk out of the room and agree what it is we're going to go ahead and pitch to them or start working on the next day. It gives us a broad picture, right? So we're not writing full user stories, we're not writing acceptance criteria here. It's just a wide kind of lens about everything we agree we need to accomplish at some point throughout this project. And we just talked about prioritization. What's most important, what's least important, at least from the business standpoint. And then this sense of shared ownership. So especially in a consulting model, we're doing the work, but we're all in it together. And so it doesn't matter, if we deliver functional software that ultimately is not what they wanted, we failed. If we deliver software that is what they wanted but doesn't work great, we also failed. This process in talking through all these things from a functional requirements perspective, but also non-functional dependencies, things like that in the room, helps us walk out of the room with shared ownership. But what does this really not capture in those conversations? Dependencies is one, right? So we get a sense of prioritization from the business stakeholders themselves, but it's hard to tell which things need to happen first, especially at a technical level. We don't see the guts and the wiring of a prospective product. We just know we need these features first and these features later. We don't really see relationships. There's no lines between these things. It's a matrix of rows of a journey across the product and columns about specific features to build over time, but the relationship between these things is kind of tenuous. Again, it's very high level, so it's not like you take this and you just start working tomorrow. You have to then dive into the weeds and remember a lot of the context that was talked about in the room when those stories went up on the board. And it definitely doesn't really address how we're going to do this. It drives at what and sort of when, but how is left for later. In our world, if we are proposing work to a client, we can't punt on how. How is going to be a big factor in how long something's going to take, understanding what some of the risks to the project are. Maybe there's an integration that we need to make with a client's ecosystem that isn't ready yet. So we can't just promise our side will be ready to go if we're waiting for them. That kind of doesn't get captured in this process very well. This is another sort of subchapter in user story mapping. Software isn't the point. And that's true through a specific lens of building a product that meets its users' needs. But for us, this is not quite true. Right? We don't own the products at the end of the day. If we're successful, we will build something our clients love, and we're going to hand it over to them, and they have to own it. They're not just buying some glossy end-user product. They're buying software they have to maintain forever. Unless they want to work with us forever, that's typically not the way that these contracts are going to run. We have to give them something that makes sense under the hood. Right, so everyone walks out of a successful workshop thinking about this, right? We figured it out, we talked through our problems, we're building a Ferrari. I can't wait to get back to the office and tell everyone that we're gonna do this. And that's great, and everyone should have this up on their vision board, but the engineers who are gonna ultimately have to build this thing kind of need to be thinking more like this, right? And we need to get sort of the client thinking along these lines too, because like I said, they're going to own this. It's not, if it were just our kind of secret project, we might make something that looks like this, but is really styrofoam, right? And then we go and try to drive it around or get in an accident, and it's a mess. So Validating this stuff is important too. That doesn't really happen in the story mapping process because you're so focused on paint colors and where the leather is sourced from on your Ferrari. So what else can we do to try to align what it is we're going to build under the hood? And we move to this concept of a data model. Many of you are probably familiar with it. What we're really talking about here are relationships between things. If you're totally unfamiliar with data modeling, there are 3 real types of relationships in one of these sort of data model systems that you would draw. A one-to-one relationship. Hopefully this is true of everybody here. Like each person has one head. If I find a random one of you and I text you if you have a head, you do have one head. If I find a head in here, I hope I find a person too. Right? We're not sharing either of these things. Each person has many eyelashes, right? So this is a one-to-many relationship. The inverse is not true. Everyone's going to go home. We're going to clean the office. Maybe we find an eyelash on a table on the floor. That belonged to somebody. It did not belong to 2 of you, I hope. And then a many-to-many relationship. So a person and ethnicities. I'm 75% Irish and 25% Italian, although there's probably, other percentages that I'm not aware of. Small slices, we're all probably mutts on some level. But I have multiple ethnicities, and if I choose an ethnicity, Irish, it's going to affect many people in this room. So that's an example of a many-to-many relationship. What's an example of using this in a product? This is an example story map we use all the time internally for onboarding purposes. And you don't have to get into the weeds here. It's a e-commerce platform for buying industrial parts. We see themes or epics and features and stories just as we expect. And you could walk out of the room with this as a scope with a client and feel pretty good about what it is that you need to build. But there are things here that we could think harder on. Viewing a list of products and viewing a list of apparel and viewing a digital library. These are all things that you can buy off this e-commerce site. Maybe this is really the same story represented 3 different ways in 3 different epics. Similarly, searching for stuff. Searching and browsing and filtering. They're different words, they sound like different verbs, but when it comes down to building things behind the scenes, we're talking about modifications to a SQL statement, right? We're not really talking about vastly different things. This is kind of one function, potentially, in the system we build. Add to wish list. Somebody in the room throws that up on the board, it makes perfect sense. Yeah, we should do that. There's no wish list feature or epic anywhere in here. It's just thrown up on the board. When it comes to working on that, there's a lot more stuff we need to figure out. What does that mean? What is a wish list? It's a kind of a throwaway story in here. To help kind of flesh that out, we try to think about it in this data model concept. So this is the same hypothetical e-commerce site represented in a different way, right, with these relationships. So you could potentially draw this where all those parts and pieces of apparel and user manuals, they're all just generic things in our system that we want to be able to search on, that we want people to be able to add to a wish list. We want people to be able to find items and put them into some sort of cart, and that cart ultimately, hopefully, gets turned into an order and just doesn't sit stagnant in that cart forever. It makes sense to try to look at these things together. So while in our lean requirements workshops, while product managers and product designers are very focused on the story mapping process and the user journey process, engineers should be thinking about these kinds of things. What are the relationships that I hear you talking about? What are we going to have to build behind the scenes? And then when all is said and done and everyone leaves feeling good, work together to figure out, is there anything in my drawing that's you're not represented in yours, and is there anything in yours that's not represented in mine? And are there questions that arise in that discussion about maybe there was a lack of understanding about a very specific topic? It gives an opportunity for us to validate some of the stuff that goes on under the hood with a client in a visual way and make sure that we ask more questions if necessary before we commit to doing things. This is that same original story map that we were looking at before, but reconfigured in a way that aligns more with what that data model looked like. So if we put them sort of side by side, scope-wise, largely the same kind of concepts, it's just a different way of organizing it. Why? Why do that? Well, we talked about some of this stuff already. There's the potential for a consolidation of some of the effort. So if we had those three sort of search or list stories that we looked at, those could all end up in a backlog in different epics and get story pointed and get worked on and end up as three different pieces of code in the back end. And they all work. It's not like it's going to fail, but in doing something like that, there's additional effort for our clients, there's additional cost, and with that goes additional technical debt. If we have three different gallery kind of concepts going on, and the client says, well, we want to add a new feature or some new functionality to all of them, we're doing 3 times as much work as we were before, and we say, oh, you know what we should have done? We should have consolidated this stuff in the beginning, and now we're maintaining it all over the place. That's debt that ends up in your backlog. Now you write stories for consolidating this stuff later, when maybe a little bit of effort up front thinking of things in a different way could have saved us the trouble. Another quote from the User Story Mapping Bible, right? The best estimates come from developers who really understand what they are estimating. That's kind of like, sure. But that's a real reason to do this, because it does force engineers to think through some of the underlying things in the room while the client is there, and work with product managers to figure out if everyone's on the same page, think through some of the dependencies in the system that aren't captured in the story map, think through relationships. Sometimes the difference between thinking something is a one-to-many relationship and it turns out to be a many-to-many relationship is a huge wrench thrown into the process. You have to rethink a lot of different stuff. Maybe you had database tables that you thought were ready to go, and now you have to kind of reimagine your whole setup. So, as far as why, validating what we heard with the client in a different way, and better estimation in considering the project or the product in 2 different lenses. A third potential benefit here is if this work is big, this is a very small looking story map. If we're talking about a digital transformation and rebuilding an entire enterprise platform, there's a lot more than this, right? Both wide and deep. That work might need to be broken up into teams. Maybe some of the stuff that we're talking about ends up as separate microservices on the back end. And we have a specific microservice for everything about users and a specific microservice for everything around the cart and ordering parts. Having the work organized in a way that it can live in its proper service at the end and have separate engineering teams think about those things is a way to create less friction in the system. So if we had, say, 3 different teams working in our code base and we didn't organize the work the right way and we had sort of stories spread across the system in ways that they weren't built in the back end, you could have 3 different teams all having to write work on stories in the sprint in the same code base, and that happens all the time. It's not that that's the end of the world, but there's additional sort of work and friction in the system in making sure, pull requests code is reviewed and pull requests are done on time. Branching potentially gets more complicated, whereas if you had organized your backlog and planned your work with the team in a way that was more aligned with what the code base actually looks like, then maybe you have some savings down the road with respect to this stuff. So organization of a backlog is a potential win here. Last, what happens if there's some conversation in a room around saving a search? So in our story map, we have the concept of people searching for parts. There was nothing in there about wanting to save a search. As we start thinking about what do we do next, what's the stuff that we're not talking about in this version of work but we know is probably coming, we can start to think about those things in this diagram. And how does that change relationships that we already kind of assume we need to build? So if we're going to build some sort of functionality around saving searches, that becomes sort of a new object in this model. And we can then think about the relationship between searches and users. What is saving a search mean? Is it just every time somebody types in keywords and hits save, we just save the keywords and associate it with that user? Is that a one-to-many relationship where any individual user can just have many searches, but searches only belong to one person? Or you can brainstorm around what happens to the system if we say that's actually a many-to-many relationship. So any given person can have 10 searches saved, but if we save searches as independent things, maybe that same search can belong to 1,000 users. And what insights can we learn from that? There are two potential wins there. There's data storage, potentially, if we're talking about millions and millions of searches or billions of searches, and 60% of those rows are duplicative because we're just saving everything with a user every time. That becomes a performance problem. Similarly, if 60% of the searches are the same, we can more quickly develop some insights and some dashboards around, hey, are you aware, e-commerce company, that 60% of the people are searching for the same thing? We have, here's a graph of everything going on in your system with the saved search, and you see that everyone's looking for this very specific item. Maybe that needs to be highlighted in a way that you're not thinking about. Maybe you're not even aware of that. You can catch that stuff in analytics, right, and drop stuff, some third-party package, and try to find these things out. But if you do capture something that way, you're going to have to go back and account for it in the back end anyway. So there's not a lot of cost in doing this up front, and there's the potential for a big upside. 5 whys, excuse me. Consolidation of effort in what engineers are going to have to build, validation with stakeholders on what's going to be under the hood. What does that chassis look like for the Ferrari, and not just shiny paint? Better chance to estimate the work better for engineering. Optimization of the backlog. If this thing grows, it needs to be split into 10 microservices with 10 engineering teams working on it. And hopefully less debt in the backlog because of forethought and more opportunity for those bells and whistles and wins with a client later when you think about how you can add new features. Thank you for your time. Thanks for stopping by. We hope to see you again.